But first, big spoiler warning for Avengers Endgame is ahead. So first, let's break down this last scene step by step. So it looks like the Avengers have set up some kind of mobile lab on the lake where the Avengers headquarters used to be. Steve Rogers is about to go through the quantum realm to return Mjolnir and the Infinity Stones to their proper place and time. First, he says goodbye to Bucky, who seems to know right away that Steve is taking a one-way trip. He says, "I'm gonna miss you." Then they have a dialogue exchange that is a direct copy from this dialogue from First Avenger.
Don't do anything stupid until I get back.
How can I? Taking all the stupid with you.
Sam asks how long it will take, and Banner replies prophetically, as long as he needs. Then Cap misses his time return, and they find him, now over 100 years old, sitting by the lake. Bucky looks at Sam and tells him to go ahead. See, I think that Bucky knew Steve's plan all along, and he also knew that Steve wanted Sam to become Captain America. But more on that later. Anyways, Steve's mission to return the stones was successful, and I do think it's funny that he had to return the Soul Stone to the Red Skull on Vormir. Like, imagine that Clint had just left with the stone, and the Red Skull thinks that his curse is over, but then his greatest enemy shows up to make sure he has to stay on the mountain for several more years. Then Steve tells Sam that he decided to take Tony's advice and get a life. So when did Steve decide to do that? Ever since coming out of the ice, Cap has reconciled that he can never go back. In his WandaVision from Age of Ultron, he rejects Peggy's offer for a dance because he knows that he can't go home. And later, he loses his temper when Tony implies that they can all live normal lives.
Isn't that the why we fight? So we can end the fight? So we get to go home?
And by the end of that film, Steve even says that he's moved past that desire and he's reconciled himself to being a man out of time.
Family, stability. Guy who wanted all that went in the ice 75 years ago. I think someone else came out.
But earlier in Endgame, Steve is so close to Peggy that he can almost touch her. That's when he realizes that they could be together again. This moment stirs something inside of him, and he realizes that there is a way for him to go home. So he goes back and lives a full life with Peggy. They were married, judging by the ring on his finger. Ever the gentleman, he offers no details, just that it was beautiful. By the way, old Steve looks a lot like Joe Biden, right? Anyways, Sam says he doesn't want to live in a world without Captain America. Then Steve passes on the shield to Sam. This happens in the comics with the Falcon taking the mantle of Captain America for a while. But also in the comics, Bucky became Cap before Sam. So there's a little moment, a slight nod that Bucky gives to Sam that acknowledges he's given him his blessing. Now again, this makes me think that Steve told Bucky his plan before he left. That way, in case Steve didn't return, Bucky could be the one to pass on the shield. And when Sam does finally accept the shield, the theme from First Avenger swells for a moment. Then, Long Long Time by Kitty Cowan plays, and we see that Steve finally got the dance that was alluded to way back in First Avenger.
I might, even when this is all over, go dancing.
Then what are we waiting for?
The right partner.
So what happened here? How did Steve live a whole life with Peggy and no one noticed? Why did he age when he's full of super soldier serum? Where did the shield even come from when it was destroyed by Thanos? And if Captain America was alive for 80 years, why did he not prevent Thanos from ever getting the stones? Well, the movie leaves a lot open to interpretation, but we have a few theories. First, why did Steve age? Well, Steve stopped aging because he was frozen in ice, not because he's a super soldier. Being a super soldier probably allowed him to survive being frozen though. The same goes for Bucky. He was given the super soldier serum, but Hydra placed him in stasis for decades, only bringing him out for specific missions. But Steve does look pretty spry for a centenarian. The super soldier serum doesn't make him immortal, but it keeps him in pretty great shape. So, next question, where did Steve get this shield after his old one was destroyed by Thanos? Well, he just spent 80 years in the past. He could have asked Howard Stark to make him a new one. Howard doesn't have a surplus of vibranium.
That's the rarest metal on Earth. What you're holding there, that's all we've got.
But Steve could have gone to Wakanda for more, knowing what he knows now about their customs. But the big question is, how did Steve live with Peggy for decades without affecting the timeline? Well, to answer that, I have to explain a little bit about how time travel works in Endgame. Basically, it's impossible to change your own past. When the Avengers changed events in the past, they're not affecting their own past. They're only creating alternate timelines. So there's an alternate timeline where Loki escaped with the Tesseract, and where Thanos dies before the Guardians of the Galaxy are ever formed. So what does this mean for Steve and Peggy? Well, as soon as Steve decided to stay in the past, he created an alternate timeline. And maybe in this alternate timeline, he changed his name and he just lived a quiet life. He wouldn't have prevented Thanos from getting the stones because everything needed to happen in an exact way for the team to succeed. He knew that Captain America would eventually be unfrozen, lead the Avengers, and help defeat Thanos. And like the movie says, even if he had prevented Thanos from getting the stones, it wouldn't have actually changed his own past. Anyways, so yes, for a few years, Steve would have coexisted with young Steve. But this only brings up more questions. Does that mean that young Steve visited old Peggy while old Steve hid in the next room? How about Peggy's funeral? Was old Steve hiding somewhere? Or did they have two funerals? Otherwise, wouldn't Sam and Bucky remember seeing old Steve around? Alright, well, it's confusing because it's time travel, but the key thing to remember here is that you cannot change your own past or memories. So when Steve created an alternate reality, his own past would have remained intact. And since Sam and Bucky were part of that past, they would also remain unchanged. So here's my theory on how all of this time stuff works. Steve lives out his life with Peggy in this alternate timeline that is very similar to his own timeline. Imagine that there's two timelines running almost parallel to each other. One is the MCU as we know it, but in the other, Steve Rogers gets to grow old. But then, when old Steve naturally arrives at the point in time he left, the branch in time heals itself and he rejoins his original timeline. And maybe that alternate reality continues on, with or without some version of old Steve Rogers. What do you think about Endgame's ending? Does it make sense? Does it even matter if it makes sense? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.